Hello, everyone, and welcome to Episode 3 International Responses to Japanese Aggression. Let's begin now. So, who is going to respond to the aggression? We are going to look at three things in this talk. The first thing we're going to talk about is the League of Nations. Okay, what was their response to the growing aggression of Japan in Manchuria and then into China? I mean, this was their job. This is why they were created. The second thing we're going to look at today is China. What was China's response to this? They are the ones who are being invaded. But we also want to remember that they are also in the grips of a civil war while this whole thing is happening. And the last group that we're going to look at is the United States of America. What is their response to growing aggression and militarism by Japan? The United States is in a nice spot right here. They have two oceans between all the conflict that's going on in the 30s. So they're going to enjoy a nice little thing that we call isolationism. So we're going to start with the League of Nations. Okay, so first with the League of Nations. Now, we did a whole lesson on the League of Nations at the end of World War I. We had our little acronym there. It failed because it was dumb, and we had a reason for all of those letters of those words. So hopefully you can kind of call back to that. I'm going to come up with two questions here at the beginning that you guys should be able to answer. What was its purpose, and why didn't America join? Okay, if you were paying attention during that lesson I did a month ago, you should be able to answer this no problem. So what was its purpose? We should know that its purpose is there for collective security. The idea that the nations of the world would protect each other. If one member nation was being too aggressive and trying to take over a smaller country, the League of Nations would collectively step in and protect it. That was the idea of this collective security. But we know from our lesson that ultimately America doesn't join this, even though it's an American idea, right? This was Woodrow Wilson's idea of the League of Nations. This was the 14th point of his 14 points, if you can see it there. The formation of a League of Nations to guarantee independence for all countries, large and small. So why didn't they join? Okay, you should be able to answer this. They don't get it kind of passed through Congress. Ultimately, they feel that it's going to have to be America that goes out and puts all the fires out throughout the world. Okay, that they're going to be called upon to be the main police force for the League of Nations. And they don't really want to have to do that. So that's really one of the main reasons why America doesn't join into the League. We also need to remember that the League of Nations has no military of its own. So it really relies on member nations to volunteer their army if conflicts do arise. And that's really another major reason why America doesn't join. Well, they know that they're going to have to be the police force, and they're going to have to be using their soldiers and their army to go out and do this. So they don't have to join. Then they're not bound by any kind of agreement to get involved. America's going to enjoy that isolationism, and they don't really feel that they need to get involved with conflicts that are going to be going on in Europe and conflicts that are going on in the Pacific. So what are they going to use? The League of Nations really has to hope that some of its bigger members, like the British or the French, can volunteer their armies to help with this. Another thing I want you guys to know about is something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact. Now, this was an agreement to outlaw war. And that's really all it was. An agreement to outlaw war, signed by most established nations in the world on August 27th, 1928, and is still in effect today, according to international and U.S. law. Now, this is really just a great sentiment. I mean, what a great idea. All of the developed, established nations coming together, outlawing war. You cannot declare war on anybody. War is not an option. A very good sentiment. And that really goes with the spirit of that internationalism of the 1920s, of the world coming together, signing treaties, signing pacts, disarming the world. We in 2020 can't really fathom what being drafted and going off to war would have looked like. But people in 1928 would have had a vivid memory of 10 or 15 years prior to this, of going through the First World War and the devastation of the First World War and what that did, and the repercussions that had. So they are trying their best to not repeat this major tragedy. Okay, they want to avoid war at all costs. So it's really just kind of a great sentiment. But the idea is, in practice, this doesn't really work. What if one country says, well, we don't really agree with this. We're going to go and look out for ourselves, which is what happens in the 1930s when other nations become a little bit more nationalistic, like Japan. And then again, what we'll be talking about is Italy and Germany. So yeah, this is signed in 1928. Here we have another political cartoon. Okay, if we can see this. It says Manchuria at the top there. Here we have our Japanese soldier figure here. Very militaristic with the gun kind of running the bayonet right through the Kellogg Pact here. Kind of on the entryway to Manchuria. So it really doesn't care for this idea of outlawing war. The Japanese soldier is going to kind of plow right through that on its way to Manchuria. And the Kellogg-Briand Pact is kind of like the dummy there, the practice dummy that you don't really care about. So the next thing I want to talk about is the LYTTON report. Now this is a report that is commissioned from the League of Nations, where they sent a British guy, Lord Lytton. You can kind of see him in the picture there, in the foreground. They're going to send a commission over to Manchuria. Okay, this is right after the Mukden incident that I talked about in the previous lecture. This is 1931 when that explosion of a Japanese-controlled railroad in Manchuria is blown up. Right, this is the Mukden incident of 1931. The Kwangtung Army has sabotaged their own controlled railroad and have blamed it on the Chinese. Wink, wink, right? It was really them that did it to themselves, hoping to give themselves that justification to continue a full-on takeover of Manchuria. So what's the response to this Mukden incident, right? There's been an explosion of the railroad in Manchuria. So the League of Nations sends a commission, right? That China now needs the League of Nations for assistance. This is their job. This is why the League of Nations exists, to go in and investigate these actions. If one small country like Japan looks like it's being aggressive, the other country, China, asks for help. Now, we also need to remember that Japan is a member of the League of Nations as well. So they're there in the meetings, in the delegations. So they're in the room as well. We just kind of have to remember that. So as a result of the Mukden incident of 1931, the League of Nations organizes a fact-finding mission to Manchuria. This is the LYTTON Commission. Now, Japan is in full support of this. They don't mind the League of Nations sending down a commission to investigate and write up a whole report on this. Why? Well, how does this kind of benefit Japan? They're okay with this whole commission going down and investigating. Well, if we remember from our talk on the League of Nations, we know that the League of Nations takes forever to do things. They move very slowly. Decisions have to be unanimous and whatnot. So Japan is okay with this because as the commission and investigation moves at a snail's pace, Japan and its militaristic aggression is going to move quite quickly. By the time the LYTTON report is finished, it's almost about a year later. And by that point, Manchuria is now Manchukuo. it's pretty much a little, too late. They took too much time. But what the result of the Lighton report does find is that they do find that Japan is in the wrong and that Japan should remove itself from Manchuria. But it's kind of too late now. Manchuria has already taken over it. It's already known as Manchukuo. They've set up a puppet emperor there with Puyi. So things have escalated out of control of the hands of the League of Nations. And when the League of Nations condemns them and says that they should leave Manchuria, Japan eventually leaves the League of Nations. Okay, we saw a clip of that in the previous episode where the delegate of the League of Japan at the League of Nations basically says, we don't like the way we've been treated. We don't like the results of this findings. We are officially leaving the League of Nations, and they all get up and walk away. Now, how is the League of Nations perceived with this? Okay, their whole purpose was collective security. They did an investigation. They came up with a report. They found Japan was in the wrong. Japan just says, okay, then we're leaving the group. We're leaving the League. And it shows that the League of Nations is now useless. It is left powerless. And every nation in the world is kind of watching this. Let's take a look at this political cartoon. Here we have another one done by David Lowe. We have our Japanese person on trial there, kind of sticking his nose out at the judges of the League of Nations. The Japanese person on trial is holding a machine gun in court, showing his aggressive militaristic nature. The judges are all kind of labeled as sanity, good faith, justice, and honor. And here we have the Lytton report with all these kind of Eurocentric League delegates. Now the caption says, Judge, the court orders you to respect the law and sentences you to a good talking to. And then Al Japan says, and I order the court to mind its own business, and I sentence it to go and chase itself. Which I guess was a pretty sweet burn back in the 1930s, but I don't know. The whole thing's titled Trial by Geneva. So again, we see kind of the League of Nations, although it has filled out its Lytton report and finds Japan guilty, they're really just kind of giving them a slap on the wrist while Japan mocks very militaristic Japan mocks the integrity of the League. So a sidebar here now. As Japan pretty much gets up and bows out of the League of Nations, Italy and Germany see this unfold. Okay, this is kind of where we're going next in our case study. We're going to be looking at Italy and we're going to be looking at Germany. They are going to follow suit. Okay, Mussolini here says the League is weak. Adolf Hitler, now is our time to strike. The League of Nations has shown its hand. They are useless and powerless to any growing militaristic nation that is aggressive in taking over other areas. They are very useless in settling these conflicts. So here I'm going to have a couple of questions. Why doesn't the League of Nations do something? And why don't all members come together to stop this? Maybe go ahead and pause the video and try and come up with a few answers for yourself. Why doesn't the League of Nations do something? This is their job. This is why they were created. Why don't all member nations come together to stop these aggressive actions in Manchuria? Pause the video and write down a few ideas. We'll see how you did in a few seconds. Okay, so let's see how you did. First, we really do have to remember that the League of Nations is very Eurocentric. The main members, particularly Great Britain and France, are very Eurocentric. This is a hard sell for them to go to war, for them to escalate to full conflict in Manchuria and China is a hard sell to the public. Their people, their young men in Britain and France, to say that we're going off to war to help China defend itself from Japan, it's a hard sell. And most of these countries are democracies. where their leaders are elected. So they really do have to bow down to the will of the people. If the public are not willing to support a conflict that's happening on the other side of the world, they're going to listen to that, and they're going to dictate in their foreign policy. We also have to remember that in the early 30s, 1931, 1932, we are now in the grips of the Great Depression. So in this regard, every country is kind of looking out for themselves a little bit more, their own self-interest, dealing with their own economic problems. We're not really having that big international feeling that the 1920s had. We're taking care of ourselves. Japan is the fourth largest economy in the world at this time, and they are a big trading partner with these Western nations. So they want to continue that through these difficult times of the Depression. The United States is not obliged to go to war, right? They never joined the League of Nations, so they are not bound by any treaty or agreement to go to war. And when Britain and France know that the United States isn't there to help, they can't do it alone. So this political cartoon really reiterates what I was just talking about on the previous slide. Here we have all our very Eurocentric League of Nations, basically just a clone of each other. Old white man in a top hat cloning themselves. This is the League, pleading, asking, and asking our Uncle Sam American figure here to go stop the conflict that's going on in the distance here. Way in the distance, we see Japan and China fighting themselves very brutally and savagely with swords. So here we have our very Eurocentric group here, kind of pointing towards the conflict, showing the way for America to go out and stop this conflict. That was the hope of what the Americans would do if they joined. And that's really why they don't join. They don't want to go out there and stop all the conflicts. Okay, now we're going to look at China's reaction to Manchuria. We know Manchuria is invaded in 1931. We also need to remember that China at this time is still fighting each other. It is in the grips of a civil war between Jiang Zemin or Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists versus Mao Zedong and the communists. And what was their reaction, really, when we talked about the other day? What does eventually the Chinese nationalists under Jiang Zemin eventually do with Manchuria? They pretty much kind of set it loose and cut its losses and kind of gives over Manchuria to Japan. So this is also perceived throughout the world as well. The League of Nations takes note to this as well. China doesn't seem to really be trying to fight for Manchuria. Why should the League of Nations? If China's not trying to get it back, why should the League of Nations go through all so much trouble to go and help? The next figure we're going to look at is this man right here, Zhang Zuolin. Now, he's the son of Zhang Zuolin. If you remember him, Zhang Zuolin, he was the Manchurian warlord before he was assassinated and Manchuria falls into Japan's hand and becomes Manchukuo. He's the son, Zhang Zuolin. Now, he's basically a Manchurian warlord without a Manchuria. Manchuria is now Manchukuo with a puppet emperor, Puyi. So he obviously wants Japan out and Manchuria back. But in order for that to happen, he really needs China to stop this civil war. He needs them both sides, the nationalists and the communists, to stop fighting and work together. So this is where the story gets pretty interesting. So in December of 1936, he kidnaps the nationalist leader of China, Chiang Kai-shek, who is fighting a civil war with Mao. He kidnaps him. There you can see a picture of them together. And he arranges a meeting between Zhu Lang and the communist leader. That's Zhang Zuolin eventually gets a meeting between Zhu Lang and the communist leader. In 1936, The communists and the nationalists in China will form the Second United Front. So it works. This whole ploy and kidnapping works. He doesn't kidnap them to hurt them or hold them for ransom or anything, but really to just negotiate a kind of ceasefire for this civil war. So the Second United Front has now been established. Remember, we had that First United Front with that Northern Expedition earlier on. So the Civil War looks like has come to an end. Well, at least a pause has been put on the Civil War, because after 1945, it's going to start right back up again. So now we are in the grips of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japan invades mainland China. They already have control of Manchukuo, and now they are laying siege to coastal towns of Beijing and Shanghai. They start to move more inward into mainland China. We talked about the raping of Nanking last episode. So this does overall go poorly for Japan. Even though they seem to have success in battle, overall it's going to go very poorly for Japan. It goes very poorly for China too. We talked about all of the devastation and wartime atrocities that happened during this time, but it's going to go poorly for both sides. The more Japan is brought into mainland China, the further they are from their resources, and it's just difficult to keep. They just really underestimate the sheer size of China and their resilience to keep fighting. Okay, this war between Japan and China continues until 1945, when ultimately the USA drops 2 atomic bombs on Japan for them to surrender this war. Wang Jingwei is the next guy we're going to talk about here. Now, he is from China, but we're going to talk about how some people thought that Japan was going to win. Okay, certain people in China felt, looks like Japan's going to win this, and I better be on the right side of this when it's over. It could be better for myself if I'm on the winning side of this. So some Chinese sided with the Japanese. And one guy we're going to look at is Wang Jingwei. So he works out a deal with Japan, and Japan makes him the leader of the new government of China. Now this is the area, the eastern portion, that Japan has already conquered. Right? They've swept in through Shanghai, through Nanking. The whole eastern side of China is under their control. That is what Wang Jingwei will be a head of, kind of a puppet government there. So he's obviously going to be seen as a traitor by other Chinese leaders. And eventually there's an assassination attempt on him. Ultimately, the point of this slide is really just to show that not everyone was against the Japanese. There were some Chinese that become kind of turncoats or traitors and side with the Japanese. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at today is the American response. So we are now in the 1930s, and the United States is enjoying their policy of isolationism. Now we should remember that this is just really militarily. Just militarily are they enjoying this isolationism. They're not getting involved with conflicts in Europe or in Asia, as tensions are mounting kind of all over the world here. But economically, they are very much a player on the world stage. Okay, they have one of the world's best economies. They are a big player on the world stage. Just militarily are they isolationists. Henry Stimson, who's the American Secretary of State, is going to denounce the Japanese aggression in China. But for this time, they're still going to trade with them. Trade and commerce still continues with the Japanese. They're still going to trade oil and steel. It's going to make them a lot of money in the States, so they continue with that. Congress will eventually pass neutrality acts, which ultimately keeps America out of the war. Now, this is more or less a result of World War I. America why does America really join in on the side of the Allies? We discussed that in class when we were talking about World War I. I mean, why do they side with Britain and not so much with Germany? Well, we know the British naval blockade really helped because they couldn't get goods into Germany. The fact that Britain was English speaking and then they had kind of a common history also plays a major part. They had given out a lot of loans to the Allies, and they needed to see the Allies win so they could get those loans back, right? There's a lot of kind of economic reasonings there. They don't want to kind of be in that situation again. So the Congress hopes that these neutrality acts will keep America out of war, even though they still have trade and commerce with nations. So these neutrality acts will forbid the United States from selling arms or trading goods to nations that are fighting a war. So if there is a conflict and there is war happening, America cannot sell them arms, which means planes and tanks and guns and ammunitions. They can't do it. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt finds kind of a loophole for this. Okay, he really does want to help out financially and militarily to the Chinese, despite these neutrality acts. So FDR, he's the president of the United States at this time. He serves like 4 terms. He's like the only president that does 4 terms. Much of the 30s, so much of the Depression through World War II. He eventually dies in 1945, and eventually Truman steps in and drops some bombs. But FDR wants to give financial and military support to the Chinese, but as far as these neutrality acts say, they're at war, they can't trade. But he cleverly finds a loophole, as China never declared war on Japan, nor did Japan really officially declare war on China. Even though the spirit of this law is kind of taken advantage of, I mean, you'd look at that and say, well, they're at war. FDR says there was no formal declaration of war. We're going to start trading with and helping out financially and militarily China. So the first thing they implement is what's known as a moral embargo against Japan. They won't ship any military goods. They're still going to sell oil. They'll still sell steel. They're going to make a lot of money off oil and steel from the Japanese. But any military goods, they're not going to ship them any planes. They're not going to ship them any replacement parts or manufacturing elements for their war machine. But the oil and steel is still being shipped. The U.S. will send planes and financial aid to Chinese nationalists fighting against Japan. That's that loophole of those neutrality acts. By July of 1941, the United States freezes Japanese assets. This is now a full embargo. No oil and steel will be shipped or traded to Japan. We talked about that last episode. This is pretty much seen as an act of war now against Japan. It's pretty much after this point, Japanese Navy and Army are planning their attack against the major Pacific fleet in Pearl Harbor. So here's the result of those embargoes. Okay, a big picture here of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. So after those embargoes, Japan starts planning for Pearl Harbor. In their mind, war has already begun. On December 7th, there's that surprise attack. The United States declares war on Japan the very next day. And the war between Japan and China has now merged with World War II. And the people of America are fully behind this war. This is kind of a different tone from World War I. America feels that they have been attacked. They have every justification and right to go to war for this. So the feeling and tone in America is totally different. Even pacifists and other kind of anti-war groups really kind of fell into line and supported this war. So that concludes our case study on Japanese nationalism and aggression. I hope you've been enjoying these. Please like and subscribe. Leave a comment down below. Hit that bell for notifications and all that other nonsense. Yeah, and I'll be talking about Italy next.